I have investigated countless cases across the years, but only a handful ever managed to create a silence in the room when their files landed on my desk. The case of Missy Bevers was one of them, not because it was the most violent, nor the most complex in terms of forensic data or crime scene chaos, but because from the very start it carried a type of darkness that didn't belong to a peaceful town like Midlothian. Some cases feel like puzzles. Others feel like warnings. But this one felt like a shadow that already knew my name before I opened the first page. When I received the early documents, the storm outside my window was beating against the glass with a force that sounded too familiar compared to the rain described in the crime scene logs. The first responding officers had written that the weather at approximately 4 in the morning was harsh, windy, unpredictable. Thunder rolled through the Texas sky, while one of the most disturbing murders in recent years played out inside a church. A place meant for sanctuary became a trap, and a woman who only wanted to guide a fitness class at dawn became the central figure in a mystery that still has not been solved. Missy Bevers was 45 years old, a mother, a wife, an instructor of early morning boot camp sessions. She carried an energy about her that people described as bright and encouraging. In a world full of people too exhausted to lift their heads, Missy was the type to stand in front of a room and remind you to push forward. That morning should have been no different. She should have arrived early, as she always did, set down her equipment, smiled at the first students to walk in, and filled the church with the usual motivational calls she was known for. But this time, someone else was waiting. The video footage is something I've watched far too many times. Every investigator who came into contact with this case was haunted by it in one way or another. There is no sound, only the grainy glow of indoor surveillance cameras capturing a figure dressed head to toe in what appears to be tactical gear, a helmet, a vest with the word police across the front, heavy boots, a weapon of some kind in the hand, although the exact nature of it remains debated to this day. The figure walks through the church hallways with a slow, almost curious movement, not like a criminal searching for valuables, not like someone nervous about being seen. This person behaves as if they belong there, as if they have all the time in the world. That was the first red flag for me. Burglars panic. Contract killers move fast. Rage-driven attackers show signs of adrenaline. But this person walks in a strange rhythm, stopping occasionally to push open doors or break small pieces of glass, gestures that seem unnecessary, almost theatrical, as if performing for the camera rather than attempting to avoid it. That in itself tells a story, and not a comforting one. The timeline is painfully precise. The figure entered the church around 3:50 a.m. Missy arrived at 4:16 a.m. Within minutes, the two paths collided in a moment that no camera recorded. The fatal encounter happened in a corner of the building where surveillance coverage did not extend. When the first students arrived a short time later, they discovered her lying on the ground with severe wounds, injuries consistent with blunt force trauma inflicted repeatedly, intentionally, and with a motive that was anything but random. One of the earliest questions in any homicide is whether the victim was chosen or simply unlucky. In Missy's case, there was no doubt. The killer was inside before she arrived. The killer walked the halls without aggression until her arrival was imminent. The killer attacked only her, took nothing, left everything else untouched. This was a mission. Understanding Missy's life was essential. Investigators combed through her public posts, noting her habit of promoting her classes on Facebook. That meant her schedule was visible to anyone watching, anyone obsessed, anyone angry, anyone with a reason to harm her. A digital trail of predictable behavior is often more dangerous than people realize. And Missy's killer may have followed that trail step by step throughout my career. I've learned to pay attention not just to what a suspect does, but what they choose not to do. In the footage, the killer makes no attempt to disable cameras, no attempt to hide their silhouette, no attempt to move quietly, even though the boots echo subtly in the empty hallway. They did not rush. They did not hide. They wanted to be seen, but not recognized. That level of psychological detachment is rare. The case took a turn when the public was invited to help identify the killer's walk. Dozens of tips came in. People joked online that even Bigfoot could be identified if we had this much footage. But reality quickly cut through the humor. Not a single tip gave investigators the breakthrough they needed. The body proportions were distorted by the gear. The walk was unusual, almost gender ambiguous. Experts debated whether the killer was male or female. If you cannot determine gender, height, or age, you are left staring at a ghost. For a moment, the investigation turned toward Missy's personal relationships, as they often do. Marital issues, financial stress, rumors of messages exchanged with people outside her marriage. Nothing concrete enough to accuse anyone, but enough to suggest that someone might have been emotionally invested in her life. There were messages she received from unknown accounts, flirtatious and unsettling. These threads were thin, but they mattered. People don't escalate into violence overnight. They grow into it through resentment, fixation, jealousy, or desperation. One particular line in the case notes caught my attention the first time I read it. A witness claimed that Missy had expressed concern about a message she'd received not long before her death, something that didn't sit right with her, something that suggested someone was watching. That detail stayed with me. Victims often sense trouble before investigators do. They don't always understand what the feeling means, but they feel it nonetheless. Years later, I would revisit that moment in my mind whenever I tried to reconstruct the killer's psychological state. If the killer had been stalking her digitally, maybe even physically, then the church was not chosen for convenience. It was chosen because it isolated her, because it was early, because it was dark, because it allowed the killer to approach without witnesses, because it created a false sense of security. When I stepped into that church myself, years after the crime, I felt an eerie disconnect between the purity of the place and the violence that had occurred inside. People imagine that a crime scene carries the residue of fear or the echo of screams. But in truth, it is the silence that disturbs you. A silence that makes you imagine things your mind isn't prepared for. A silence that wraps around you like a memory that doesn't belong to you. I walked the hallways the same way the killer had done, tracing their steps to understand the sequence of movement. I paused where they paused. I pushed open the same doors. The air was cool and still, but in my mind I could almost see the faint reflection of tactical gear passing by. The security camera above my head was the same model used in 2016. It hummed silently, capturing everything, and I wondered whether the killer at any moment had looked directly into that lens and smiled behind the visor. Criminals sometimes leave a signature, not always a physical one. Sometimes their signature is in their behavior, their choices, their arrogance. And the killer in this case displayed something I recognized instantly: confidence. They knew they wouldn't be caught, or believed it strongly enough that hesitation never appeared in their movements. That confidence is dangerous. The more I studied the footage, the more I became convinced that the breaking of glass and the opening of random doors was not to find something, but to create noise within the investigation. A smoke screen? Something that suggested a burglary? something to pull attention away from the truth. The killer was waiting specifically for Missy and no one else. When you work in homicide long enough, you develop an instinct for intention. And everything about this case pointed to intention, preparation, and emotional investment. The killer either hated Missy, envied her, feared her, or believed she represented something that needed to be destroyed. You do not strike someone repeatedly in a dark hallway unless you have internalized a reason strong enough to justify it to yourself. This is not the randomness of a stranger. This is the inevitability of someone who believed the confrontation was unavoidable. Before I left the church, I stood in the same spot where her body had been found. The overhead lights were dim, casting long shadows across the floor. I tried to imagine the moment when she realized she was not alone. Did she hear the boots? Did she see the silhouette emerging from the corridor? Did the killer speak? Or was the entire encounter conducted in absolute silence? Silence can be a weapon. As I stepped back outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the Texas landscape. Morning light washed over the town the same way it had on the day she died, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded hours before the world woke up. Cases like this do not grow cold because of lack of effort. They grow cold because the killer designed them to. And in this case, the design was meticulous. I knew then that the investigation would not hinge on finding a new piece of evidence. It would hinge on understanding the psychology of someone who walked calmly through a church minutes before ending the life of a woman who had never harmed them. That kind of person doesn't vanish. They wait. And in part 2, I will take you deeper into the suspects, the digital footprints, and the fractures within the timeline that hint at a truth more unsettling than anything that appears on the official record. This is Miller Files, and the case is only beginning. I have watched thousands of hours of surveillance footage throughout my investigative career, from bank robberies to cartel executions to cases where the camera was the only witness left alive. But nothing ever stayed with me quite like the footage from inside the Creekside Church of Christ. The figure wandering those hallways has become one of the most recognizable silhouettes in American true crime, yet remains the most unidentified. A contradiction that defines the case itself. When you play the footage for the first time, the initial impression is almost underwhelming. The figure doesn't move with urgency or aggression. There is no dramatic entrance, no sudden violence. Just a slow walk, deliberate in its own strange way, through the corridors of a quiet church at nearly 4 a.m. But the more times you watch it, the more disturbing it becomes. Every step, every shift of weight, every unnecessary gesture begins to reveal something about the person behind the mask, as if their subconscious had forgotten the camera was there long before their body did. The footage begins with the figure entering through a side door, their silhouette framed briefly by the light from outside before it fades as the door closes. The tactical helmet covers the head, and the vest marked police covers the torso, making the person appear broader and more imposing than their natural build might be. But what stands out immediately is not the gear, but the gait. A peculiar roll of the right foot, a slight inward collapse of the knee, a dip in the left shoulder that accompanies each step. Not exaggerated, but noticeably asymmetrical. The walk of someone with a mild physical condition, an old injury, or simply a natural imbalance in their biomechanics. I pause the footage at the exact moment the figure turns a corner. Their feet angle out slightly, and the right leg appears to swing with less fluidity than the left. These details matter because the body rarely lies. A person can hide their face behind a visor, They can distort their shape with bulky clothing. They can adopt mannerisms to confuse observers. But the fundamental mechanics of how their joints align, how their weight transfers, how their muscles activate, those are truths rooted deep in the body's history. A limp from childhood, a minor hip misalignment, a degenerative condition, even a habit formed over decades. No costume can erase that. The challenge, however, is that the gear adds ambiguity. Tactical boots alter posture. Weighted vests change the center of gravity. The helmet affects head positioning. These variables contribute noise to the signal, making it nearly impossible to determine the person's gender, even approximate height. A bulky outfit can make a small person appear large and vice versa. What should have been a simple identifying feature became the perfect camouflage. At one point in the footage, the figure stops and turns their head toward an empty room. For a moment, I thought they might enter it. Instead, they simply stand there, almost as if listening. But for what? There were no other people in the building, and the storm outside would have drowned out any distant sounds. Yet the stillness in their posture implied focus, anticipation, the kind of micro-moment where a person mentally maps the space around them. They weren't searching for valuables. They weren't looking for electronics. They were orienting themselves inside the building, ensuring that when the time came, they would not be surprised. Then comes the most disturbing part, the breaking of glass. The figure raises the object in their hand, likely a hammer or similar blunt instrument, and strikes a small window pane near a door. The sound is not captured on video, but the motion tells the entire story. The swing is casual, low energy, almost lazy. Not a strike meant to breach. Not a strike meant to intimidate. Instead, it feels like a symbolic gesture, something done for effect rather than purpose. I have seen burglars smash windows with adrenaline, fueled intensity. I have seen killers break barriers with frantic desperation. But this was theatrical. A performance. When investigators later examined, they noted it was superficial, easily avoidable, meaningless from a practical standpoint, which leads to the uncomfortable conclusion that the act was meant to mislead, to introduce randomness, to create noise in a case that would otherwise form a singular and obvious trajectory, that the killer was waiting specifically for Missy. The figure continues through the hallway, occasionally stopping at doors and opening them with the small breaching tool. The movements are inefficient. They angle the tool incorrectly. They use the wrong leverage. These are the mistakes of someone unfamiliar with forced entry, someone imitating a SWAT officer rather than functioning as one. Their body tilts as they apply pressure, and their stance widens awkwardly, the way a person adjusts their balance when they aren't confident in what they're doing. This is important because it tells us the suit is not the killer's comfort zone. It is a costume. Around 4 minutes into the footage, the figure reaches the front of the sanctuary. There is a moment, just a heartbeat, where they turn their body slightly toward the camera. Many people watching the clip for the first time miss it, but when you freeze the frame, the tension becomes undeniable. The killer knows the camera is there. They look directly into it, and yet there is no attempt to hide, no lowering of the head, no shift in posture. Instead, the face shield reflects the light, creating an eerie, emotionless mask. This is where behavior becomes psychology. Most criminals avoid cameras instinctively. Even if they're wearing disguises, the subconscious drives them to look away or duck their head. But this figure embraces visibility. They invite it. They perform in front of it as if acknowledging its presence, almost tauntingly. This tells us one thing with certainty. The killer was confident that the footage would not identify them, and confidence like that is not common. It is cultivated, learned. It comes from believing that you understand the limitations of the system watching you. We then move to the behavior timeline. From 3:50 a.m. to 4:16 a.m., the figure remains entirely within camera-monitored areas. That is nearly half an hour of footage, enough time for even the most amateur detective to piece together movement patterns. And yet, despite the extensive documentation, the killer never reveals anything decisively recognizable. No distinctive gestures, no speech, no reaction to environmental stimuli, just silent movement. Profilers often talk about baseline behavior versus goal behavior. Baseline behavior is the natural way a person acts when they are not actively committing the crime. Goal behavior is their behavior during the crime itself. The footage shows only baseline behavior. This means the killer viewed those 30 minutes as preparation, not execution. A psychological warm-up before the confrontation. Another detail stands out. The killer never attempts to enter spaces irrelevant to their path toward the attack location. They don't investigate the office rooms in depth. They don't explore closets. They stay primarily in the central hallway systems. This suggests they had scoped the building before. Whether physically or digitally, they knew the layout. They understood where Missy would likely enter, or at least where they needed to position themselves to intercept her. When Missy's car approached the parking lot at 4:16 a.m., the killer was somewhere off camera, somewhere close, somewhere waiting. The exact location remains a mystery, but by calculating the killer's movement speed earlier in the footage, an average of 0.9 meters per second, we can determine a rough radius around the final camera recorded location. The killer was likely within one of 3 hallways, all of which connect to the space where Missy was ultimately attacked. The proximity indicates intentional positioning. They had calculated the timing. This is not improvisation. This is choreography. Profiling the killer requires accepting an uncomfortable premise. They are not a typical violent offender. Their behavior lacks the impulsive markers of rage or panic. Their body language lacks the fluidity of experienced criminals. Instead, they embody something more unnerving, someone whose emotional detachment allows them to carry out violence with an almost mechanical stillness. Detachment does not mean lack of motive. It means the motive has been internalized to the point of emotional numbness. As I watched the footage again late one night, the building around me empty and my desk lit only by the glow of the monitor, I found myself leaning forward, searching for any moment where the façade cracked. A misstep, a hesitation, a sign of humanity, but there is nothing. The figure never falters, never rushes, never shows signs of second-guessing. The most chilling killers are not the ones who rage. They are the ones who wait. Missy walked into the building unaware that a person who had just spent nearly half an hour pacing the corridors was positioning themselves for the moment she arrived. That final minute before the attack is not captured on film, but in my mind, the footage plays itself. The figure hears the sound of the front door. They turn, their posture changes. They ready the weapon. Their steps become more direct. The baseline becomes the goal. And the church, a place built for faith and peace, becomes the final frame of the timeline that no camera ever recorded. But the timeline does not end there. It stretches into the early hours after the attack, into the life of the killer as they walked out into the storm, into the quiet comfort of knowing they had remained anonymous. despite being seen. The walk that defines them is the same walk that conceals them. In Part 3, we will unravel the deeper psychological construction of this anonymity. Why someone would choose to disguise themselves not only physically, but behaviorally. Why the costume was not just a shield, but a message. And why the killer's silence in the hallway may reveal more about their identity than any forensic detail ever will. This is Miller Files, and the shadow in the hallway is only beginning to speak. There are moments in every difficult investigation when the evidence stops speaking and the silence begins to communicate more than the physical clues ever could. In the case of Missy Bevers, that silence wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of intention, a silence so carefully constructed that the killer's true identity began to emerge not through what they did, but through what they chose not to do. Only when the timeline was fully assembled and the movements inside the church were scrutinized with a clinician's eye did the deeper psychological structure begin to reveal itself. To understand a killer like the one who ended Missy's life, you must abandon the assumption that they behaved irrationally. Violence often appears chaotic, but chaos is rarely the core of a targeted homicide. Beneath the brutality lies a blueprint. Some killers leave a mess because they panic. Others leave a mess because they want investigators to think they panicked. And a smaller, far more dangerous category of killers leaves a mess designed to appear random while every detail has been considered long before the victim ever entered the room. Missy's killer belongs to the last category. Criminal profiling is not a mystical art. It is not reading minds. It is a science rooted in patterns, behavioral baselines, and the understanding that every offender carries their past into the crime scene, whether they intend to or not. When I began examining the figure in the church not as a shadow, but as a psychological organism, the first truth that struck me was almost paradoxical. The killer was both highly controlled and fundamentally fractured. Control is visible in the timing. They entered the church well before Missy arrived, but not too early. That timing reflects anticipation balanced with caution. They wanted to ensure they were inside before she appeared, yet they also wanted minimal time spent waiting in one place. This tells me the killer had rehearsed the window of arrival. They knew Missy's habits, her punctuality, her commitment to preparation, the kind of knowledge that is not gained through a single observation, but through repeated monitoring. Control is also visible in the rhythm of the movements. The killer walks slowly, yes, but not aimlessly. The slowness is deliberate, meant to maintain composure, meant to conserve energy, meant to mask the internal tension. It is the same kind of measured pacing I've seen in experienced stalkers, who spend long stretches shadowing their targets without being detected. People expect rage or frenzy in killers, but that expectation often blinds them to the more dangerous type, the emotionally blunted offender who experiences the world with diminished affect and compensates through ritual. Fracture, however, reveals itself in the costume. The police vest, the helmet, the knee pads, the heavy boots. None of it worn with fluidity, none of it tailored, none of it aligned correctly as a trained tactical officer would wear. This is not the uniform of someone who belongs to law enforcement. This is the uniform of someone who wants to appear powerful without possessing power. Someone who wants to be feared but lacks the internal authority to generate fear naturally. The costume is an exoskeleton for insecurity. I have encountered offenders who use costumes for one of two reasons. The first is camouflage, a way to bypass detection by appearing legitimate. The second is something far more psychological, the assumption of an identity the offender feels they lack in their everyday life. Serial impersonators often choose uniforms for the same reason. Actors choose roles they provide a sense of identity, discipline, and meaning otherwise missing from their lives. By wearing the gear of law enforcement, the killer symbolically adopts the role of judge, enforcer, and executioner, not merely hiding who they are, but becoming, for a moment, who they wish they were. This is where the fracture deepens. The killer does not simply want anonymity. They want transformation. The question is, transformation into what? When I replay the footage at the moment where the figure lifts the breaching tool to break the small window, the movement is almost tender, not clumsy, but soft. The arm rises without tension, the wrist neither rigid nor forceful. This is not the swing of someone trained in tactical operations. It is the swing of someone whose relationship with violence is emotionally distant. They are not enraged. They are not excited. They are dissociated. Dissociation is a hallmark of offenders who compartmentalize their lives. They can work normal jobs, speak politely to strangers, pay bills on time, and contain a growing void within themselves that is only expressed during a carefully chosen moment of release. These offenders don't explode spontaneously. They erupt in a single, focused action, usually after weeks or months of internal rehearsal. The rehearsal here appears in the killer's movements. They navigate the hallways with familiarity. They rarely hesitate. They open several doors, not because they expect to find anything behind them, but because their internal script tells them to perform certain actions to maintain a sense of preparedness. This is ritualistic behavior, repetitive, predictable, anchoring. A killer who strikes spontaneously does not ritualize, nor do they walk with the strange mixture of rigidity and fluidity seen in the footage. The shoulders remain stiff, while the legs move with a looseness that is almost unnatural. This body language suggests someone imitating strength. The posture is a mimicry, not an embodiment. When the psychology of a killer does not match the physicality of a killer, a dissonance forms, and that dissonance is what we see on the tape. Profilers often talk about the fantasy life of offenders. Whether they admit it or not, every targeted homicide is an attempt to fulfill a fantasy. Sometimes the fantasy is revenge, sometimes domination, sometimes the restoration of perceived power. What the Missy Bevers footage shows is a killer living inside a fantasy of authority. The tactical gear, the slow pacing, the unfazed interaction with cameras, every movement expresses control they do not possess in their real life. The church becomes a stage, the camera becomes the audience, and the costume becomes the only identity that makes the killer feel whole. The question of motive becomes clearer when we understand this fantasy. Missy Bevers represented something the killer could not tolerate. Whether that was envy, rejection, competition, or personal grievance, Missy embodied an emotional trigger. Her confidence, her visibility, her role as a motivator and community figure, these qualities can inflame the insecurities of individuals who define themselves through inadequacy. She was everything the killer was not: alive, energetic, admired. Offenders often target symbols, not people. To the killer, Missy was a symbol, a representation of the life they felt denied. Her public persona, her online presence, her enthusiastic engagement with others. These are the kinds of traits that can provoke individuals with fragile identities, especially those who wear disguises not only on the outside, but in their internal narratives. When I reconstructed the likely confrontation, I imagined the killer waiting in the shadows, listening for the sound of Missy's arrival. Their breathing steady, their grip firm, but not tense. The dissociative calm still in place. Missy entering with the same routine she had followed for years. The killer stepping forward, no words spoken, no dialogue exchanged. The blow delivered with the same emotionless force as the earlier strikes against glass. No escalation, no anger, just execution. Psychologists classify offenders like this as organized but emotionally deficient. They plan the external structure while remaining internally hollow. Their violence is not expressive. It is symbolic. And when the act is done, their emotional state often remains unchanged. They leave the scene the same way they arrived, empty. When I examined the killer's exit path, the same calm was present. No sprinting, no stumbling, no frantic escape. They leave with the same slow, steady gait. Even after committing murder, even knowing others will soon arrive, they remain inside their protective shell of dissociation. This tells me something extremely important. The killer did not experience fear of apprehension. Their fantasy world was still intact. They believed in the inevitability of their escape, and this belief has shaped the case ever since. Killers who feel invisible remain invisible longer. They do not confess. They do not boast. They do not repeat the crime. They slip back into their fractured lives and pretend nothing happened. Years can pass without a single crack in their armor, but armor cannot remain intact forever. Psychological exoskeletons corrode. Dissociation is never permanent. The mask eventually slips, at least in private moments. Somewhere, this killer has had those moments. They have watched the footage online. They have listened to podcasts. They have read comments. And when viewers remark on the bizarre walk, the costume, the ritualistic movements, the killer has felt something no one else can detect: recognition, because the one thing they cannot dissociate from is themselves. Part 3 teaches us this. The killer is not a phantom. They are a fractured human being with real desires and real wounds. Their mask is powerful, but masks are fragile by design. The psychology behind this crime is not the psychology of a mastermind. It is the psychology of a person collapsing under the weight of their own inadequacy. The act did not empower them. It exposed them. And as we move into Part 4, we will examine how that exposure radiated outward into the investigation, how the killer's attempt to remain invisible actually revealed parts of their identity, and how the fractures in their psyche, reflected in their walk, their costume, and their ritual, may ultimately be the very cracks investigators need to finally identify them. The mind behind the mask is beginning to take shape. This is Miller Files, and the shadows are starting to align. Every investigation develops its own gravity. Some cases draw evidence toward them with magnetic clarity. Others repel it, scattering the truth into fragments, too small to make sense of on their own. The case of Missy Bevers became the latter almost immediately. What should have been a straightforward homicide with a visible suspect, an identifiable timeline, and a confined location instead unraveled into a maze of broken clues, misplaced assumptions, and investigative pathways that ended abruptly in silence. When I reviewed the official documentation from the earliest days of the investigation, something struck me with the sharpness of a warning shot. The case suffered not from lack of evidence, but from the overwhelming presence of misleading evidence. Crime scenes sometimes scream the truth. This one whispered lies. The church itself was the first lie. A place of sanctuary presented itself as a labyrinth of misdirection. The broken windows, the forced doors, the cluttered pattern of movement inside the building, all of it performed by a killer whose mask was not only physical but strategic. Investigators initially treated the church like the primary puzzle, but in reality, it was the killer's stage. And stages are designed for illusion. What troubled me most was how quickly the presence of surveillance footage created an illusion of clarity. When investigators know a camera captured the suspect, they instinctively feel closer to the truth. But surveillance often deceives. It shows only what the suspect allows it to show. It documents performance, not intention. And in this case, the killer's performance was so carefully curated that the footage became both the strongest piece of evidence and the largest distraction. The first major misstep occurred when early analysts attempted to anchor the case around the physical characteristics visible in the footage. Height estimates ranged widely. Gender assessments contradicted each other. The gait analysis produced half a dozen competing theories, each convincing on its own, but impossible to reconcile together. Instead of narrowing the suspect pool, the footage expanded it exponentially. The figure in the hallway became almost mythic, morphing in the public imagination from a small woman to a tall man to a limping intruder to a disguised professional. The truth drowned in possibility. This is the danger of focusing too intently on what the eye sees instead of what the behavior reveals. Around the same time, the investigation splintered into secondary branches, each logical in isolation, but collectively overwhelming. Family members were scrutinized. Personal messages were examined. Local residents were interviewed. Fitness students were questioned. The digital trail from Missy's social media accounts sprawled outward into a list of potential persons of interest that grew faster than investigators could reasonably process. But the greatest breakdown came from the collision between law enforcement procedure and public fascination. This case entered the bloodstream of American true crime culture almost instantly. The eerie footage circulated online. Amateur sleuths dissected the killer's movements with near religious devotion. People analyzed the cadence of the steps, the bend of the knee, the sway of the arms, constructing theories that bled into the official narrative, contaminating the investigative timeline. Public scrutiny can illuminate truth, but more often it creates noise, and noise is fatal to precision. One specific thread exemplifies the derailment. A woman seen walking strangely inside an outdoor equipment store became an early fixation. The public dubbed her the SEOC woman, and large swaths of online investigators became convinced she was the killer. Their certainty spread like wildfire. Tips flooded the department. Screenshots circulated. Armchair profilers compared angles and shadows and pacing patterns. All of this pressure forced law enforcement to dedicate resources to confirming or eliminating her, even though there was no concrete link between her and the crime scene. Eventually, she was ruled out, but the time lost was irreversible. This misdirection was not accidental. It was a side effect of the killer's design. By choosing a costume that distorted gender, body shape, and gait, the killer effectively weaponized ambiguity. They forced investigators into a perpetual fog. No matter how one interpreted the footage, the opposite interpretation could be equally justified. That level of behavioral camouflage is rare. It requires insight into human perception. A killer who understands how to make themselves unreadable is one who has spent a long time hiding. The second failure stemmed from the building layout itself. The lack of comprehensive camera coverage created a blind spot that the killer exploited flawlessly. Investigators attempted to reconstruct the killer's exact path, but the building contained too many angles and architectural dead zones. Without forensic evidence tying the killer to a precise location inside the church, investigators were forced to rely on educated guesses. And educated guesses, while occasionally powerful, are vulnerable to narrative drift. Narrative drift occurs when investigators begin filling gaps in evidence with assumptions that feel correct, rather than assumptions that are supported by behavior. Over time, these assumptions harden into unofficial truths. The danger is that once an assumption becomes embedded, new evidence is interpreted through its lens rather than allowed to stand independently. The Bevers case suffered from this almost immediately. Some investigators believed the killer waited near a specific hallway. Others insisted the killer was hiding in a closet or storage room. Still, others theorized a direct ambush near the equipment area. Each theory shaped how the crime was understood. None were proven, but because the case demanded answers, the void was filled with certainty that did not exist. Another broken clue in this case came from the outside environment. The weather that morning was severe, heavy rainfall, strong winds, low visibility. Most potential external witnesses were inside their homes, asleep. Street-level audio was masked by the storm. Even the killer's exit route was likely concealed by the downpour. Weather can be an accidental ally to a killer. In this case, it felt like a deliberate one. The killer chose a time when nature itself erased evidence. Somewhere within the first 48 hours, the investigation absorbed yet another fracture, the question of motive. Multiple potential motives existed, each strong enough to demand attention. Personal grievances, jealousy, obsession, professional conflict, social media entanglements, and the ever-present possibility of a stalker hiding behind anonymous accounts. The problem was not the lack of motive, but the abundance of possible motives. The investigation began stretching itself across too many fronts. When motive cannot be prioritized, suspects cannot be prioritized. And when suspects cannot be prioritized, time becomes an enemy. In reviewing the case, I noticed a pattern in the investigative notes. Each lead seemed momentarily promising before dissolving into nothing. Interview after interview ended with the same conclusion: no evidence tying the person to the church, no forensic trace, no digital footprint. The killer had either avoided leaving evidence entirely or ensured that any evidence left behind was indistinguishable from environmental noise. This is not the mark of a criminal mastermind. It is the mark of someone whose life has trained them to navigate invisibility. People who occupy the margins socially, emotionally, or psychologically develop strategies for not being noticed. When individuals like this commit violence, they carry their invisibility with them. One clue that continues to haunt me is the killer's total indifference toward valuables. Cash boxes were untouched. Electronics were ignored. Doors were opened, but not searched. Every action felt symbolic rather than goal-directed. This suggests the killer was not acting out a traditional criminal script, but rather performing a ritual designed to create investigative confusion. By mimicking elements of a burglary, they created false pathways. But rituals reveal more than offenders intend. They expose the inner architecture of a mind shaped by pattern, repetition, and controlled fantasy. As I pieced together these broken clues, one truth became increasingly evident. The killer wanted investigators to search for the wrong kind of person. They wanted law enforcement to focus on height charts, shoe impressions, gender debates, and superficial interpretations of body language. They wanted the public consumed by speculation. They wanted noise. Noise protects silence, and the killer lives in silence. But the most powerful clue in this case was never inside the church. It was outside the church, in the weeks and months leading up to the crime. The killer was not created the night of the murder. They were shaped long before. Their insecurities, their grievances, their obsession, these were formed over time. The crime was not a beginning, but a culmination. The path to solving this case does not lie in reinterpreting the footage. It does not lie in narrowing the gate analysis. It lies in understanding the human behind the mask, because somewhere in their life, long before they put on the tactical vest, they revealed themselves. Part 4 teaches us that broken clues are not failures. They are fragments of truth scattered intentionally by someone who believed their mask was impenetrable. But masks crack. Narratives unravel, and the trail of broken clues eventually leads back to the person who tried hardest to obscure it. In the next chapter, we will examine how those fractures inside the killer, combined with the trail of ritualistic behavior they left behind, may ultimately converge. Patterns begin to repeat, motives sharpen, and the silhouette in the hallway becomes less myth and more human. This is Miller Files, and the truth is no longer hiding, it is circling. There comes a point in every unsolved case when the facts grow quiet, the theories grow loud, and the truth settles somewhere between them, like dust on an abandoned stage. When I look at the case of Missy Bevers, I do not see a story frozen in time. I see a story still moving, still breathing, shifting its shape every time new eyes examine the footage or read the reports. But despite all the angles, all the investigations, all the hypotheses, the figure in the hallway remains exactly what they were the moment they stepped into the church, a shadow that refuses to define itself. As I reached the final stretch of this investigation, I returned once more to the beginning, not to repeat the same steps, but to observe the space between them. In cold cases, the truth often resides in the moments investigators walked past without noticing. Not because they were careless, but because the human brain seeks patterns, and patterns sometimes hide the singular detail that refuses to belong. When I rewound the footage yet again, late one night long after the world outside had settled into its sleep, the figure appeared more familiar than before, not because I recognized them, but because I recognized the psychological architecture behind them. The slow, drifting steps, the ritualistic movements, the watchfulness without anxiety, the detachment, the emotional void. These traits are not random. They are the residue of a life shaped by profound internal conflict. The killer did not kill out of impulse. They killed because the act fit into a private narrative they had constructed long before Missy walked through that door. That narrative is the invisible map of this case, and if we follow it far enough, we reach a type of truth that does not identify a name, but identifies a psyche. To understand the psyche, we must step into the darkness the killer inhabited before the crime. Not the darkness of a single night, but the darkness of a life lived with an identity that never felt fully formed. People like this are shadows long before they commit violence. They move through the world feeling unseen, unheard, unnoticed, except when they make mistakes. Invisibility becomes a prison, and sometimes, tragically, they seek release in the only act that forces the world to acknowledge them destruction. But the killer in this case did not seek public recognition. They did not crave fame or infamy. They did not leave notes or taunts. Their desire was quieter, more insidious. They wanted to feel powerful in a world where they never had power, and taking a life, especially the life of someone vibrant, admired, and present, became the ultimate expression of that stolen authority. When I walked the perimeter of the church years after the murder, the building felt strangely unchanged by time. The grass outside had grown and been trimmed countless times. The interior had likely been repainted and rearranged, but the air held an echo that architecture can never repair. Crime scenes never truly revert to innocence. They carry imprints, mental, emotional, invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable to those who understand their language. As I stood at the entrance, Missy walked through that early morning. I imagined her carrying her equipment, unlocking the door, stepping into the dark building with the trust of someone who had done it hundreds of times. Her routine was her comfort. Her comfort was her vulnerability. Routine gives us structure, but it also gives predators a predictable map. The killer depended on that predictability. They shaped the timing of their arrival around it. They sculpted their entire plan around the predictability of a woman who simply wanted to guide a morning workout. Crime often emerges from the intersection of opportunity and obsession. In this case, the opportunity was created by the early hour, the empty building, the storm masking all sound, and the predictable routine. But the obsession, that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere unknown. The obsession was personal, not necessarily because the killer knew Missy intimately, but because Missy represented something that triggered their internal conflict. As I traced the killer's psychological timeline, I noticed one detail that continues to unsettle me: their complete absence of hesitation. People imagine murder as an act of rage or chaos, but in targeted killings like this, the absence of hesitation is more revealing than the act itself. It tells us the killer made the decision long before the moment arrived. It tells us they rehearsed the crime in their mind. It tells us they lived inside the idea of the act before committing it. And when the time finally came, they were simply fulfilling a narrative they had already accepted as inevitable. This is why the footage feels so haunting. We are not watching a person preparing for murder. We are watching someone who decided long ago they would kill. The footage is not preparation. It is ritual, a psychological descent, a private ceremony inside a costume made of borrowed authority. The costume itself remains one of the most striking clues. People continue to debate its purpose. Was it used to conceal gender, height, body shape? Was it chosen because the killer fantasized about being a figure of authority? Or was it simply practical? The truth likely lies in a combination of all these reasons. But one detail cannot be ignored. The killer wore the costume with discomfort. They adjusted the gear. They walked awkwardly in it. They carried themselves like someone stepping into a persona they had not fully mastered. This tells us the costume was not an extension of their identity. It was an attempt to replace it. People who feel empty often build identities out of symbols, uniforms, roles, costumes. The killer stepped into the church not as themselves, but as who they wished they were. And Missy, in her brightness and confidence, represented everything the killer was not. Violence becomes symbolic when identity is fractured. As the investigation continued, the lines between truth and speculation blurred. But one element remained constant. The killer left the church with the same calmness they entered. No panic, no rush. They simply vanished into the storm, as if the rain absorbed their presence. That departure has always bothered me. It is the kind of departure that signals not relief, but completion. After reviewing countless interviews, digital records, GPS logs, and psychological profiles, I have come to believe the killer did not expect to be caught. Not because they believed they were clever, but because they believed they were invisible long before the crime. People who live in the shadows assume the shadows will protect them, even when they step briefly into the light. And now, after all these years, we arrive at the question that hovers above this case like a silent specter. Does the killer feel remorse? I do not believe they do. Remorse requires emotional integration, the ability to see oneself clearly. The killer in this case lives behind too many layers of fractured identity to experience such clarity. Instead, I believe they occasionally revisit the footage, not out of guilt, but out of the need to re-enter the moment where they felt most powerful. The moment where the mask fit perfectly, the moment where the ritual was complete, somewhere in their quiet home or in a life that appears ordinary from the outside. The killer carries the memory like a hidden artifact. Perhaps they buried the costume, perhaps they destroyed it, or perhaps they kept a piece of it, tucked away in a drawer, a symbolic relic from the moment they became who they believed they needed to be. As for the investigation, it remains suspended between possibility and closure. There will always be theories, new analyses of the footage, fresh eyes dissecting each gesture, teams building models of the killer's movement, communities forming hypotheses. But the truth is not in the footage alone. It is in the intersection between the footage and the psyche. The shadow in the hallway is not unknowable. It is simply unrecognized. The killer walks among ordinary people. They speak casually to strangers. They navigate daily life beneath a mask far older than the one they wore that night. And each day that passes, the mask becomes harder to remove. What remains now is not uncertainty, but inevitability. People like this cannot escape themselves forever. Something in their life will crack. A relationship, a confession, a digital misstep, a moment of vulnerability. When that crack appears, the shadow will finally have a name. Until then, the hallway remains, the footage remains, the storm remains, and the killer remains exactly where they have always been in the space between what we see and what we understand. This is Miller Files, and the case is not over. It is simply waiting